The coffee machine hissed, a lonely sound in the empty diner. Outside, snow fell in thick, silent sheets, burying the city in white. Maya wiped down the counter for the 10th time, the scent of bleach and burnt sugar clinging to the air. It was 2 in the morning, the dead hour when the world felt like it had forgotten this little pocket of light on a forgotten street. The bell over the door was a ghost, its chimes swallowed by the storm. She was just about to flip the sign to closed when the door pushed open against a drift of snow, letting in a gust of impossible cold and a small, hunched figure. He was an old man, Korean, his face a roadmap of deep lines etched around weary eyes. His coat, though beautifully cut from dark wool, was thin and dusted with snow, and he shivered with a violence that seemed too much for his frail frame. He didn't speak, just shuffled to the counter and sank onto a stool, his hands trembling on the formica. Maya's heart gave a familiar, painful squeeze. He looked like her grandfather had in his last years. Tired. Cold. She poured a mug of coffee without asking, her movements practiced and quiet. She slid it in front of him. "On the house," she murmured. He looked up, his dark eyes surprisingly sharp, and gave a slight, formal bow of his head. He wrapped his frozen fingers around the warm ceramic, but the shivering didn't stop. That wasn't enough. In the back, simmering on the lowest heat, was her own dinner. A thick, savory soup, rich with ginger and garlic and slow-cooked beef, the recipe a fragile inheritance from her grandmother. It wasn't on the menu. It was hers. She ladled a generous bowl, the steam rising in a fragrant cloud, and placed it before him with a spoon. "Eat," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "It'll warm you up from the inside." He looked from the soup to her, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. He picked up the spoon, his hand still shaking, and brought it to his lips. He closed his eyes. The tension in his thin shoulders seemed to melt away with that first taste. He ate the entire bowl in a slow, deliberate silence, the only sound the gentle clink of the spoon against porcelain. When he was done, he placed the spoon neatly beside the bowl. The shivering had stopped. A little color had returned to his cheeks. He reached inside his fine coat, but Maya held up a hand. "No. It's a bad night. You just get home safe." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze so intense it felt like he was seeing not just her tired face and worn uniform, but every decision that had led her to this empty diner in the middle of a blizzard. "Thank you," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. He slid off the stool, gave another small, precise bow, and disappeared back into the white curtain of the storm. The next morning, the world was painfully bright, the snow muffling all sound. Maya's small apartment felt like a sanctuary, warm with the smell of brewing coffee and the quiet hum of her old radiator. The diner had let her go home early after the old man left, and she'd slept a deep, dreamless sleep. She was standing by the window, watching the city dig itself out, when she saw them. 2 black sedans, gleaming and immaculate, parked on her slush-covered street. They were so out of place they looked like a tear in reality. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach. Men in dark suits got out, moving with an unnerving, synchronized grace. Then, a knock on her door. Not a polite rap, but a solid, definitive sound that vibrated through the floor. She froze, her mind racing. Landlord? Police? She crept to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She peered through the peephole. A mountain of a man stood there, his face completely impassive, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses even in the gray morning light. He was just standing there, waiting. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he would wait all day. "This is how it starts," a frantic little voice in her head whispered. "The moment your life stops being yours." She took a deep breath, unlocked the 3 deadbolts, and opened the door a crack. The man didn't speak. He just inclined his head toward the car. From the back seat of the lead sedan, another man emerged. He was younger than she expected, maybe in his early 30s, and he moved with a liquid stillness that was far more intimidating than the bodyguard's bulk. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit, no overcoat despite the biting cold. His face was sharp, intelligent, and held a profound, bottomless exhaustion in the dark pools of his eyes. He stopped a few feet from her doorway, the cold air swirling around him. He wasn't looking at her apartment, he was looking at her. His gaze was heavy, analytical, like a collector assessing a rare, unexpected find. "Miss Maya Washington?" he asked. His voice was quiet, a low baritone with a precise, almost musical cadence. It was a voice that never had to be raised to be obeyed. "I am Lee Min-jun," he said the name as if it should mean something to her. It didn't. "My grandfather visited your diner last night." A cold dread washed over her, colder than the winter air. The old man. The soup. It was a simple act of kindness. But the man standing before her, with his silent army and his expensive, predatory stillness, was not here to thank her for a bowl of soup. Something is terribly wrong. Have you ever done something small, something you thought was nothing, and had it unravel your entire world? That's what this moment felt like for Maya. If you've ever felt that sickening drop in your stomach, that realization that you've stepped into a story much bigger and darker than your own, let me know in the comments which moment in your life felt like this. He didn't wait for an invitation. He simply stepped across the threshold, and the air in her small apartment instantly changed. It became charged, heavy, the space shrinking around his presence. The large man, calm, remained in the hallway, a silent, immovable statue guarding the door. Min-jun's eyes swept over her tiny living space, the worn armchair, the stack of library books on the floor, the single, thriving fern on the windowsill. It was a slow, methodical inventory, and she felt a hot flush of shame at its sparseness, its poverty. Then his gaze settled back on her, and it was just as intense, just as assessing. "My grandfather," he began again, his voice still unnervingly calm, "is a man who values particulars. He is the head of our family. He noticed that you gave him soup that was not on the menu. Your own meal. He noticed that you refused payment. He noticed that you spoke to him not with pity, but with respect." Maya wrapped her arms around herself. He was cold. "I was just being decent." Min-jun gave a small, humorless smile. It didn't reach his eyes. "Decency is a commodity in my world, Miss Washington. A very rare one. My grandfather, Mr. Choi, believes it is a sign of a strong spirit." He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of his words settle on her. He was very impressed. So was I. She finally found her voice, though it was thin and reedy. "I don't understand what you want." "It is not a matter of what I want," he said, his tone shifting from analytical to absolute. "It is a matter of what is now necessary. My grandfather is old. The stability of our organization, our family, is paramount. For that stability, I require a wife." The words hung in the air between them, absurd and terrifying. Maya stared at him, waiting for the punchline, for the moment this turned into a bizarre, cruel joke. But his face was a mask of cold seriousness. He was the most powerful Korean Mafia boss on the East Coast, and he was standing in her threadbare apartment talking about marriage as if it were a business transaction. Her disbelief curdled into a sharp, angry fear. "You're crazy," she breathed. "You can't just walk into someone's life and claim them. This isn't some old-world drama." "I have a life. Do you?" he countered, his voice soft but cutting. "A life of double shifts at a diner that barely pays you enough to cover this rent? A life of being invisible? My grandfather saw you." "I see you." He took a step closer, and she fought the instinct to back away. "I am not asking you, Miss Washington. I am informing you of a decision that has been made. A decision that will solve your problems and, more importantly, one of mine." His calm assertion was more terrifying than any threat. He spoke of her life as if it were a chess piece he could simply move across the board. Maya's fear gave way to a surge of defiance. "No," she said, the word a small, hard stone in the oppressive silence. "Absolutely not. You can't do this." Min-jun's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, disappointment, surprise, passed through his dark eyes. "I assure you, I can." He gestured vaguely around the room. "I know about the payday loans, the medical debt your mother left behind, the eviction notice you received last month. I can make all of that disappear, or I can make it worse. But I would prefer not to." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of capability, delivered with the same dispassionate tone he'd used to discuss the weather. He was showing her the bars of a cage she hadn't even realized she was in. But just as she was about to scream, to throw him out, To do something reckless, he spoke again, and his voice changed. It lost its hard, transactional edge and became something softer, something wounded. That is not the primary reason, however. He turned and nodded to Kong at the door. The large man disappeared for a moment and returned, leading a small child by the hand. It was a little girl, no older than 6, with Minjun's serious eyes and a cloud of dark, silky hair. She was bundled in a pristine white coat and clutched a worn, blue backpack to her chest as if it were a shield. She didn't look at Maya. She didn't look at anything, her gaze fixed on the floor in front of her. "This is my daughter, Hannah," Minjun said, and the raw grief in his voice was staggering. "Her mother passed away a year ago." Hannah has not spoken a word since. He knelt, putting himself on the child's level, but she didn't react. "The doctors can do nothing. My grandfather believes her silence is a sickness of the spirit. He believes a warmth like yours is the only cure." Hannah finally lifted her head, not to look at her father, but at Maya. In her small, gloved hand, she held out a piece of paper. A drawing. It was made with crayons, the lines shaky but clear. It depicted a woman with kind eyes and a cloud of curly hair, standing behind a counter and holding out a steaming bowl. A stick figure of an old man sat on a stool, a small, crayoned smile on his face. Maya's heart cracked open. The drawing was a child's perfect, silent memory of a simple, decent act. It wasn't about the Mafia or power or money. It was about a little girl who saw a moment of kindness and held on to it like a prayer. Minjun's proposition was monstrous. But the child's silence, her quiet, devastating drawing, that was a language Maya understood perfectly. The transition was swift and disorienting. One moment, she was packing a single, worn suitcase in her cramped apartment, the sounds of the city a familiar comfort. The next, she was gliding through the gates of a sprawling estate, a place of stone and glass and manicured silence. The house wasn't a home. It was a monument. Cold, beautiful, and utterly impersonal. The air inside smelled of lemon polish and nothingness. There were no photographs on the walls, no clutter on the vast marble surfaces. It was a house holding its breath. Maya felt like a ghost haunting its empty, echoing halls. Her room was larger than her entire apartment, with a wall of glass overlooking a frozen, snow-dusted garden. The bed was enormous, the sheets a crisp, sterile white. Nothing in it was hers. She placed her small spice pouch, the one her grandmother had embroidered with faded yellow thread, on the bedside table. It looked small and out of place, a tiny, fragile piece of her history in this vast, empty present. That first evening, she found her way to the kitchen. Unlike the rest of the house, it was a space of gleaming, professional-grade steel, but it was just as cold, just as unused. A housekeeper had prepared a formal, bland meal that no one seemed to touch. Minjun ate in his study. Hannah picked at her food in silence. Maya couldn't bear it. The next morning, she woke before the sun, before the staff, and went back to the kitchen. She opened the cavernous refrigerators and pantries, finding them stocked with the finest ingredients imaginable, all untouched. She found flour, eggs, butter. Her hands, clumsy at first in the unfamiliar space, began to move with a familiar rhythm. Measuring, mixing, kneading. She was making simple buttermilk biscuits, the smell of them slowly, tentatively, filling the sterile air with something warm and real. Hannah was the first to appear, a small shadow in the doorway, clutching her blue backpack. She watched Maya's hands as she worked the dough, her expression unreadable. Maya didn't speak. She just slid a plate with a warm, buttered biscuit onto the massive kitchen island. The little girl hesitated, then climbed onto a stool. She picked up the biscuit, took a tiny bite, and her solemn face relaxed for just a fraction of a second. It was the first real thing Maya had seen happen in this house. This place was a gilded cage, no doubt about it. But in this kitchen, with flour on her hands and the trust of a silent child, Maya felt the first flicker of a different kind of power. Not the power of a mafia boss, but the quiet, steady power of creating something that nourished, that felt like home. And as she looked at Hannah, she knew she hadn't made a mistake. What do you think is the real source of power in this story so far? Is it Minjun's authority? Or is it the quiet strength Maya finds in the kitchen? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Days bled into a quiet, tense routine. Maya claimed the kitchen as her own territory. Every morning, she would bake or cook something simple, something that smelled of home. Biscuits, pancakes, a simple vegetable soup. And every morning, Hannah would appear in the doorway, a silent observer, before climbing onto her stool to eat. She still didn't speak, but she started bringing her crayons to the kitchen island, drawing while Maya cooked. They were small, strange pictures of birds with sad eyes and houses with no doors. Minjun remained a peripheral, powerful presence. He was a man who lived in doorways. Maya would feel a shift in the air and look up to see him standing there, watching her. He never commented on the food, but she noticed that the extra plate she started leaving on the counter for him was always empty later. He started taking his morning coffee not in his study, but in the kitchen, leaning against a far counter, the silence between them a living thing. It was no longer the hostile silence of their first meeting. It was something else. Something complicated and full of things that didn't have names yet. One afternoon, her phone buzzed with a call from her best friend, Simone. Maya retreated to the sterile perfection of her bedroom to answer.
Maya?
Oh, thank God. I was about to file a missing persons report. Your landlord said you just up and left. Paid off your lease in cash. What is going on? Simone's voice was a warm, frantic blast from her old life. I got a new job, Maya said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. A live-in position. It's complicated? Maya, you sound weird. Are you okay? Is someone making you say this? Blink twice if you're in a cult. Maya let out a real laugh then, a loud, uninhibited sound that felt alien in the quiet house. It was too much, too real. I'm not in a cult, see. It's just family. I'm a companion for a little girl whose father has an army of guys in black suits. I saw the cars, Maya. I called your neighbor. This isn't a nanny gig. What did you get yourself into? I don't know yet, Maya admitted, her voice dropping to a whisper. But the little girl, she needs me. She ended the call feeling more alone than ever, caught between two worlds. Later that evening, as she was wiping down the kitchen counters, Minjun appeared in the doorway as usual. But this time he spoke. You have a nice laugh, he said, his voice quiet. He wasn't looking at her, but at the empty space where Hannah had been drawing earlier. The house is not used to it, she didn't know what to say. He looked up then, and his eyes met hers across the expanse of steel and stone. For the first time, she saw past the Mafia boss, past the grieving widower. She saw a man who was just as lost in this silent house as she was. And in that shared moment of isolation, something fragile and dangerous began to take root. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday night, under the cold, indifferent light of a full moon. A storm had rolled in, not of snow, but of freezing rain that ticked against the massive glass windows like tiny, insistent fingers. Maya was in her room, trying to read, when she heard it. A thin, whimpering cry from down the hall. Hannah's room. She found the little girl tangled in her blankets, her small body rigid, her face pale in the dim glow of a nightlight. She was caught in the grip of a nightmare, her silent tears tracking paths down her cheeks. The housekeeper was nowhere in sight. Maya didn't hesitate. She sat on the edge of the bed and gently gathered the trembling child into her arms. Shh, baby, it's okay, she murmured, rocking her slowly. You're safe. It's just a dream. She started to hum a low, deep melody from her own childhood, a wordless lullaby her grandmother used to sing to chase away monsters. Hannah's rigid body slowly began to relax against her, the terrified whimpers softening into shaky breaths. She didn't wake, but she burrowed closer, her small hand clutching the front of Maya's shirt. Maya kept humming, her eyes closed, her own memories mingling with the child's fear. She didn't hear him approach. The floor was silent, his presence a sudden drop in temperature. She opened her eyes, and Minjun was standing in the doorway. The moonlight streaming through the window carved his face into sharp angles of grief and something else, something she couldn't name. He wasn't the untouchable Mafia boss. He was just a father, helpless and broken, watching a stranger comfort his child in a way he couldn't. He walked slowly into the room and stopped beside the bed. He looked down at his daughter, now sleeping peacefully in Maya's arms, and a muscle in his jaw tightened. Her mother, he said, his voice thick, raw. She used to sing to her. It was the first time he had mentioned his wife. It was a crack in his perfect, controlled facade, a glimpse into the profound loss he carried inside him. He looked at Maya, his eyes dark with 1,000 unspoken emotions. He lifted his hand, his fingers slightly outstretched, as if to touch her face, to tuck a stray curl behind her ear. An almost touch. The air between his skin and hers crackled with an impossible heat. It was more intimate than any kiss. He held the pose for a heart-stopping second before his hand dropped back to his side, his fist clenching. He had retreated back behind his walls. But it was too late. They had both seen what was on the other side. He turned and walked out without another word, leaving her with his sleeping child in her arms and the ghost of his touch hanging in the air. The fragile peace of their quiet routines was shattered a week later. Maya was in the kitchen, showing Hannah how to knead dough for a simple loaf of bread, her small hands dusted with flour, when Kong appeared at the door, his face even more stoic than usual. "Mr. Lee has a guest," he said. It wasn't a request for her to leave. It was a warning. A few minutes later, Minjun entered the formal living room, a space Maya had never seen used, followed by another man. The visitor was older, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, with a warm, grandfatherly smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. Minjun's entire demeanor had changed. He was radiating a controlled, lethal stillness. This was not the grieving father from Hannah's bedroom. This was the feared head of the Korean Mafia. "Mr. Kim," Minjun said, his voice a flat, dangerous calm. An unexpected pleasure from the kitchen. Maya could hear their low, murmuring voices, the polite cadence of their words belying the tension that poured out of the room like a toxic fog. She tried to distract Hannah with the bread, but the little girl had gone still, her eyes wide, sensing the shift in the house's atmosphere. Then Mr. Kim's voice rose slightly. "And this must be the new addition to your household." How domestic he had seen her. He was walking toward the kitchen. Minjun was suddenly there, blocking the doorway, a physical barrier between his world and hers. He had moved quickly. He had simply materialized. "My family's affairs are private, Kim," Minjun said, and the temperature in the house dropped by 20 degrees. Mr. Kim's smile widened, but it was a predator's grin. He looked over Minjun's shoulder at Maya, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. He saw her worn jeans, the flower on her cheek. He saw a vulnerability, a weakness to be exploited. "Of course," Kim said smoothly. "One must protect one's investments. She is lovely, but a bit of an unusual choice, isn't it?" For a man in your position, Minjun didn't even flinch. "My choices are my own." The two men stood there for a long, silent beat, a war being fought in the space between them. Finally, Kim gave a slight bow. "My apologies. I have overstayed." He walked away, his polite facade back in place. Minjun remained in the doorway, his back to Maya, his shoulders rigid. He didn't move until he heard the sound of Kim's car pulling away. He had protected her. In that moment, he wasn't her captor. He was her shield. The realization was terrifying, and in a way she couldn't explain, it was also a profound relief. That moment, when the mask of civility drops and you see the real danger underneath, it changes everything, doesn't it? If you were Maya, would that moment make you more afraid of Minjun or more drawn to him? Tell me your gut reaction. That night, the house was suffocating with unspoken tension. The encounter with Mr. Kim had left a poisonous residue in the air. Maya couldn't settle. She found herself back in the kitchen, wiping down counters that were already clean, the repetitive motion a small anchor in a sea of anxiety. She knew, now, that this wasn't a game. The danger wasn't abstract. It had a face and a cold, predatory smile. She was scrubbing at an invisible spot on the stainless steel when he appeared. He didn't stop in the doorway this time. He walked all the way to the island and stood on the other side, the same space where his daughter sat every morning. The harsh overhead lights cast deep shadows under his eyes, making him look weary to the bone. "He will not bother you again," he said. It was a vow. "What did he want?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Minjun looked at his hands, resting flat on the cool steel. "He wanted to see if I was weak. People like him, they look for cracks." For leverage, he finally lifted his head, his gaze locking with hers. The control was gone. All the masks, the Mafia boss, the powerful patriarch, had fallen away. He just looked like a man carrying an impossible weight. "I should not have brought you into this," he said, and the quiet honesty of it stole her breath. "It was selfish. My grandfather, he saw a light in you, and I wanted it for my daughter. I wanted it for this house." He paused, searching for the right words. "I wanted it." The confession was stark, stripped of all artifice. This wasn't about a business arrangement. It never had been. "Maya," he said, and the way he spoke her name made it a complete sentence. A prayer. A plea. "My grandfather chose you for a reason. He told me. That woman sees people. Not titles. Not ghosts. Just people." He was right for a single, devastating moment. The narrative lens shifted, and the world was seen through his eyes. He saw her standing there, fierce and fragile, and so impossibly out of place in his cold, violent world. He saw the woman who had calmed his screaming child, who had filled his silent house with the smell of baking bread, who looked at him and didn't see a monster. And the terror of losing her was a physical thing, a cold fist closing around his heart. It was a terror far greater than any rival family or business threat. It was the terror of being plunged back into the silent darkness she had so unknowingly begun to illuminate. He had brought her here to save his daughter, but the horrifying, undeniable truth was that he was the one who was drowning. The next morning, the sunlight that streamed into the kitchen felt different. Softer. Warmer. The tension from the previous day had broken, replaced by a quiet, fragile clarity. Maya was pouring batter onto a hot griddle, the familiar sizzle a comforting sound. Hannah sat at the island, meticulously coloring a picture of a large, smiling sun. Minjun was there, too, leaning against his usual counter, a mug of coffee cradled in his hands. He hadn't left. He had stayed, watching them, a silent guardian in the morning light. No one was speaking. It wasn't the heavy, anxious silence of before, but a comfortable, shared quiet. The quiet of a family. Maya slid a perfectly golden pancake onto a plate and set it in front of Hannah. The little girl picked up her fork, cut a small piece, and put it in her mouth. She chewed slowly, her serious gaze fixed on Maya. Then she swallowed. She looked from Maya to her father, who was watching her with a painful, desperate hope. Hannah opened her mouth. "More," she said. The word was a tiny miracle, a single, clear, perfectly formed word that shattered the years of silence. It echoed in the vast kitchen, loud as a thunderclap. Maya froze, her hand hovering over the bowl of batter. Minjun didn't move a muscle, but she saw the shock register in his eyes, the way his knuckles went white around his mug. He looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. Hannah, seeing their stunned faces, seemed to think she needed to clarify. She pointed a small, syrup-sticky finger at Maya. "Maya," she said, her voice a little stronger this time. The name, his name, spoken with such weight the night before. Her name, now the second word his daughter had chosen to speak. Minjun finally pushed himself off the counter. He walked over and knelt beside his daughter's stool, his eyes searching her face, as if seeing her for the first time. He gently brushed a crumb from her cheek, his large hand trembling almost imperceptibly. He looked up at Maya, his gaze raw, unguarded, and full of 1,000 emotions she couldn't begin to decipher. Gratitude. Awe. And something that looked terrifyingly like love. It wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The danger was still outside the gates. The world was still cold and violent, and their arrangement was still a lie. But in the warm, sunlit kitchen, over a plate of pancakes, a silent child had spoken. And in doing so, she had bound the three of them together, forging a family not of blood or of law, but of quiet, desperate necessity. A family that might just be strong enough to survive what was coming. Their story is just beginning. The silence is broken, but the dangers are only growing. What happens when the world Minjun commands demands a real queen, not just a quiet woman in the kitchen? The fight for this fragile family has just started. If you felt that moment, that tiny, miraculous word from Hannah, deep in your soul, then like this video and subscribe. You won't want to miss seeing if the warmth Maya brought into this house is enough to hold back the darkness waiting outside. What do you think Hannah will say next? Let me know in the comments below.